when RCMP came on to what was then a building site, the lone fighters had they got access to and control of a bulldozer, which they then proceeded to dig a ditch around the irrigation weir, the installation that puts water into the Lethbridge North Irrigation District, which feeds all the feedlot alley in Twin Buttes and such. You know, that's the huge business around here, raising cattle
Absolutely.
on feedlots.
Beef, Alberta beef, man.
Yeah, this is our so that was a very provocative act, and that provocative act was taken on the assertion that the Old Man Dam was not legal, that it was a violation of the pagan people's spiritual traditions. They get certain plants out of the river, that there's biological diversity in the riverbed. Anyway, I joined into this project. I was new. I was in Native American Studies. Of course, I'm going to be drawn to this matter.
Yeah, makes sense.
And Milton Bourne with the Tooth, when the RCMP came to shut down this bulldozer operation, he fired what he says was 2 warning shots. And suddenly there was a more or less a military confrontation at the Old Man River Dam. I was there at the time. Nelson Smollett Jr.'s son, he said, non-Indians go out and sit on the most contested area, the berm. I sat on the berm one afternoon, RCMP helicopter, 6 feet over my head, and simply sitting there, and then I could look across the way and see soldiers, well, they are actually RCMP, in the bush in camouflage gear with various kinds of submachine guns and that kind of thing.
Sheesh.
It was pretty weird. Anyway, a judge that afternoon handed down some kind of ruling. Suddenly, everybody came out of the bush, and the sort of standoff eased up. And so then the lone fighters, some of them went into hiding. There was some kind of legal document that they should be picked up or questioned. Anyway, one of the things we did was to go in to Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump Interpretive Center, which is just a couple of miles away, and interpret what had been happening. And from my perspective as a Native American Studies prof, I was very aware when the Olympics were happening in 1988, the Winter Olympics in Calgary. The Glenbow Museum had a show showing Indian artifacts largely gathered in Europe. And there was a call for a boycott of that show with the view that, hey, showing Indian heritage and tradition by, say, Petro-Canada or Shell, these are companies that are violating Indigenous people's heritage and traditions these days, right now.
It's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there.
Yeah, so for that particular type of agency, oil company, to be showing off the cultural heritage of Indian people, which is a wonderful thing to do, but nevertheless, should it be them doing it? And so this boycott of saying, we want to show off the Indian heritage of our province of Alberta in the past, but what about the present? And what about the reality? How are Native people situated now in society? And if they're being cut off from access to their traditional culture, as this dam arguably was doing, or the exploitation of the Lubicon lands, for instance, who were quite in the bush and having a traditional hunting and fishing life, maintaining their traditional heritage. If industrialization is severing that's a serious issue. So when I went into Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, and along with others gave uninvited speeches, that's what I talked about. I was subsequently, a week later, charged with speaking too loud in a public place. So Milton Bourne with the Tooth was charged with the 2 shots that he set off. I was charged with words that came out of my mouth.
Making noise?
Making intelligible noise. So theoretically, this trial was supposed to be about the the tone of my voice when I had given my talk at Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, but I couldn't help to feel maybe it had something to do with what I was saying.
Possibly the words you're using in the sentence structure and the verbiages, and they could maybe be getting an impression from it. Maybe they're listening.
And Aboriginal matters are very contentious in this area.
They are huge issues. I mean, we have a huge Native American population, and they have very specific desires that are not unreasonable, but they are definitely opposing to a lot of corporate views, which can create some dynamics which are a little bit more tricky to maneuver around for sure. Things like, pipelines.
Mm-hmm.
Pipelines. Oil companies need pipelines. Pipelines go across land. Yeah, that's an issue.
Yeah. And for instance, in British Columbia, they do not have Indian treaties. There is in this area Treaty Number 7. In farther north in Alberta, there's Treaty Number 6. Farther north yet, there's Treaty Number 8. So there is some kind of deal about the land, but where these pipelines are pointed in British Columbia, there never was a basic transaction on the Indian title with the First Nations. So these are the kind of things that, were my professional métier and continue to some extent to be my professional métier. Yeah.
So for people who aren't specifically aware, what exactly do those treaties accomplish in Alberta that we do not currently have in BC?
The treaties sort of start in what we now call Southern Ontario after the American, actually the Royal Proclamation of 1763, where the interior of North America was reserved as an Indian hunting ground. Mm-hmm. I take this to be a major stimulant, impetus for the American Revolution, what we now call the American Revolution, which was actually a civil war within the British Empire, mm-hmm. where there was a secessionist group, and they said, we don't want to be governed by these rules about having to obtain Indian consent for westward expansion mm-hmm. into the interior. This, of course, came after New France was no more. There was a place called Canada once was under French governance. It's called New France. Sometimes it was called Canada. Suddenly the British, through military conquest, were governing Canada. How would they govern Canada? They would govern it through the fur trade. This Royal Proclamation was connected to giving an advantage to the Montreal industries. So this is, I'm actually abbreviating a very short.
No, it's a huge thing.
But after the United States comes out of this revolutionary experience, the secessionist movement, the idea that you have to deal with the Indian people. And actually, they can be important as allies in military context.
We should be working together to accomplish mutual goals.
Yeah, and we can do the fur trade together. And so treaties were made in southern Ontario. Treaties were made in a mining frontier when mining was opened up north of the Great Lakes. Mm-hmm. And when the preparation was to do all the transactions necessary to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, mm-hmm. essentially to transform the Hudson's Bay Company into the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, which would involve privatizing lands, which would involve, the railway company owning lands, which would involve the railway company encouraging people to come and settle in this area and get private title to land. What about the Indian people? So the rules had developed within the British Empire that, you have to get consent. According to this Royal Proclamation, you have to get consent from Indian people. So they got as far as the watershed of the Rocky Mountains, between the Pacific and the Atlantic or the Arctic Ocean. And so that's where the treaties ended, just about 100 miles from here. So British Columbia was a distinct history. It was a colony in its own right, separate from Canada. And so it started as a colony basically in response to the California gold rush being kind of transferred northward when gold was discovered in the Fraser Valley. And then British Columbia was created and it developed its own Indian policy, which didn't include the recognition of Indian title.
Now, if I remember my history right, when we were making the railways, there's two competing companies coming from opposite ends of the country. One that started on the west and one started on the east, and they essentially met around